Queen says, "All right. Let's start." Smiley face. I welcome you all to our mythology classes. Asteria says, "Thank you." Queen says, "We have already had discussions about monsters and beasts in our classes, but let me briefly summarize them before we move on to the creatures of the night, Lamias and Empusas. The mythology of ancient Greece is as much a world of gods and heroes as it is of monsters. These beasts, sometimes born of primordial powers, sometimes cursed by the gods, and sometimes the children of other monsters, were not merely creatures of horror. They served as trials for heroes, symbols of natural chaos, and embodiments of divine punishment. Their stories echo through Homer, Hesiod, Apollodorus, and later writers, forming a vast bestiary of terror and wonder. Smiley face. At the dawn of creation, Greece imagined its most fearsome progenitors. From Gaia and Tartarus sprang Typhon, the colossal fire-breathing giant whose 100 heads spat flame and who sought to overthrow Zeus himself. With him came his mate, Echidna, half maiden and half serpent, remembered as the mother of monsters. From this pair were born the hound Orthrus, the guardian of Gyrian cattle, then the mighty Cerberus, the three-headed dog of Hades, then the serpent dragon Ladon, who wound himself around the golden apples of the Hesperides, and the immortal Hydra of Lerna, whose severed heads multiplied unless seared with fire. From the same brood came the Chimera, a fusion of lion, goat, and serpent, whose fiery breath terrorized Lycia. But not all beasts were born of serpentine chaos. Some were hybrid horrors, defying natural order with their composite forms. Minotaur, imprisoned in Deathless Labyrinth, embodied the shame of Crete royal Linum, and was a bull-headed man who devoured sacrificial youths. The Gorgons, with Medusa most notorious, bore snakes for hair and petrifying gazes. Their sisters, the Gree, shared a single tooth and a single eye between them, a grotesque parody of sisterhood. The Sphinx, known from the Theban cycle, tested travelers with her riddle, devouring those who failed to answer. On the seas lurked the Sirens Half-Womb, whose enchanting songs lured sailors to destruction, while Harpies, storm winds given female form, swooped down to snatch food or soul's smiley face. Equally dreaded were the sea monsters that threatened heroes on their voyages. Scylla, once a maiden, became a horror with 6 ravenous dog heads sprouting from her waist, while opposite her roared Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool swallowing the sea 3 times a day. From the deeps also came the generic Ketos great sea serpents, one of which nearly devoured Andromeda until Perseus intervened. Around them swam stranger beings as for example the half-man and half-fish tritons, the fish-tailed centaurs known as ichthyocentaurs, and the monstrous progeny of the sea gods Nereus and Phorcys. Priestess says, "Are you worshipping?" Queen says. The earth itself produced giants who threatened gods and men alike. The Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths, forged the thunderbolts of Zeus, though their savage cousin Polyphemus appears in Homer as a cannibal who captured Odysseus and his crew. The Laestrygonians, another tribe of cannibal giants, hurled boulders at ships and devoured sailors whole. Others, such as the Elodi, Attis and Epalts, sought to storm Olympus itself. Still more mechanical than organic was Talos, the bronze giant who patrolled Crete, his single vein sealed with a nail, a gift from Hephaestus to King Minos. Among the beasts, many were linked to famous heroic labors. Heracles slew the Stymphalian birds, man-eaters with metallic feathers that could pierce armor. Also he captured the Ceryneian hind, sacred to Artemis, but also he hunted the Erymanthian boar. And he fed King Diomedes to his own Mares. These creatures, often described in local traditions, stood as both natural disasters personified in tests of strength for the greatest heroes. Theseus, too, faced the monstrous Crommyonian sow, a great boar sowing terror, and of course the labyrinths of Minotaur. Not all monsters wore claws or scales. Even among the gods' companions, the line between beast and man blurred. The centaurs, half human and half horse, embodied untamed passion and violence, though noble exceptions like Chiron guided heroes with wisdom. The satyrs and Silene, goat-footed revelers of Dionysus, occupied the threshold between wild animality and divine ecstasy. In the skies flew the griffins, guardians of gold in the distant north, while from the blood of Medusa sprang the winged horse Pegasus, a rare monster that was noble rather than destructive. Smiley face. Asterius smirks. Queen says, as said, not all monsters wore claws or scales. Some were spirits, night demons, and shades that haunted the imagination. And here we come to the main topic of our classes today. Lamias and Empusa. Asteria smiles. Queen says, among the many spectral beings that haunted the imagination of the ancient Greeks, few were as unsettling as the Empusa. These creatures, usually referred to in the singular as Empusa, occupied a liminal space between divine servant, folkloric bogey woman, and vampiric seductress. They were not the grand monsters of epic like the Hydra or Chimera, but instead belonged to the shadowy realm of popular belief. Beings whispered about at night, invoked to frighten children, or blamed for the sudden terror of travelers. Name Empusa is thought to derive from the Greek verb empanion, to step upon or to invade, a fitting etymology for a spirit that leaps upon the unsuspecting. Ancient writers generally described the Empusa as shape-shifting female demons, whose powers of transformation made them especially dangerous. They could take on the guise of animals as cows, donkeys, or dogs, or more insidiously, that of a dazzlingly beautiful woman. Beneath these illusions, however, lay their monstrous reality. A creature with one leg of flesh and one of brass or donkey bone, and often crowned with flaming hair. Their origins were tied to Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and the crossroads, whose nocturnal retinue was said to include a host of frightening spirits. Empusa were considered her attendants, roaming the earth in the night hours, delighting in terrorizing mortals. In some traditions, they were even described as the offspring of Hecate and the spectral being Mormo. Which further connected them to the world of child-devouring demons and vampiric phantoms. Despite their fearsome attributes, Empusa appear most vividly not in solemn religious texts but in the literature of theater and storytelling. In Aristophanes' comedy The Frogs, 5th century BCE, Dionysus encounters an Empusa on his descent into the underworld. The spirit shifts forms rapidly from a cow, a donkey, a dog to a radiant woman, before revealing her grotesque leg of brass. Aristophanes plays the moment for humor, but the detail is telling that even in parody, the Empusae retain their frightening liminal nature. Asteria nods. Queen says. A bit more sinister account appears several centuries later in Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana, 3rd century. Here the Empusa is no clownish phantom but a deadly predator. Disguised as a beautiful courtesan in Corinth, she seduces a young philosopher named Menippus, preparing to drain his life. Apollonius, however, exposes her true nature and rescues the youth from her clutches. This tale aligns the Empusae closely with later traditions of the succubus and the vampire, female beings who lure men to their destruction through irresistible beauty, smiley face. Beyond literature, the Empusae functioned as figures of folk terror. Parents warned disobedient children that Empusa would snatch them away. Travelers feared her sudden appearances on lonely roads. In these contexts, she was less a seductress than a general embodiment of nocturnal fear, standing alongside related figures such as Lamia, Mormo, and the Roman Strix. Each of these beings reflected cultural anxieties that were the dangers of the night, the fragility of children, and the peril of unrestrained desire. Symbolically, the Empusa embodied the intersection of desire and dread. In one guise, they represented the threat of female sexuality, beautiful but destructive, leading men to ruin. In another, they expressed the primal fear of the dark, the shapeless terrors that dwell at the edge of human perception. They were both comic and horrific, useful as a punchline on stage, and as a moral lesson in philosophical texts. Their adaptability ensured their survival in folklore, where they gradually merged with the traditions of witches, lamii, and blood-drinking spirits in the Roman imagination. As I mentioned Lamias, we will move now to them. But before we do, are there any questions? Asterius says, no, it was all well explained. Queen says, smiles. Teacher is good prepared today. Giggles. Asterius says, yes, it was very informative. And it's a topic I like. Queen says, first I will share the sources I used. Aristophanes, The Frogs, lines 285 to 300. Philostratus, Life of Apollonius of Tyana 4.25. Pseudo-lexicon 10th C. Byzantine Encyclopedia, entry Empusa, Epsilon 2017. Scholion Aristophanes Frogs 285. Plutarch Moralia Symposiax 5.7.2. Daniel Ogden Draken. Dragon Myth and Serpent Cult in the Greek and Roman Worlds. Oxford 2013. Daniel Ogden, Magic, Witchcraft and Ghosts in the Greek and Roman Worlds. Oxford 2002. Sarah Iles Johnston, Restless Dead. Encounters between the Living and the Dead in Ancient Greece. Berkeley, 1999. Oxford Classical Dictionary, 4th edition, 2012. Entry Empusa. That were the Souses. Now to the Lamia. Asteria says, "Very interesting, thank you." Queen says, "From a cursed queen to night demon." Among the many haunting figures of Greek mythology, few are as enigmatic as Lamia. She begins as a mortal woman, a queen of Libya loved by Zeus, yet ends as both a tragic monster and the archetype of the child-devouring demon. Over centuries, Lamia transformed in the imagination of poets and storytellers, moving from a personal myth to a general name for nightmare beings. Her story reflects not only the cruelty of divine jealousy, but also the human need to personify fear and grief. In the earliest accounts, Lamia was renowned for her beauty. Diodorus Siculus describes her as the daughter of King Belus of Egypt and the Queen of Libya, so striking that Zeus himself desired her. Their union, however, invoked the wrath of Hera, who punished Lamia with merciless severity. Some versions say Hera murdered Lamia's children. Also there are others, that she cursed Lamia to slay them with her own hands. This maternal tragedy, coupled with Hera's spite, unhinged her mind. Consumed by grief, Lamia turned upon the children of others, preying on the innocent to avenge the loss of her own. And there it goes, a mother became the prototype of the child stealer, invoked by fearful parents to warn their little ones into obedience. Other authors added darker layers to her curse. Antoninus Liberalis recounts that Hera robbed Lamia of the ability to close her eyes, so that she was eternally forced to look upon her dead children. Zeus, pitying her, granted her a grotesque compensation, the power to remove her eyes from her head and set them aside, allowing her brief moments of rest. Such grotesque details mark the turning point where Lamia ceases to be simply a cursed queen and becomes something monstrous, half woman and half demon. From the Hellenistic period onward, Lamia was reimagined not as a single figure but as a type of supernatural being. Horace, the Roman poet, speaks of Lamia in the plural, using the name as if it denoted an entire race of bogey monsters. In this form, Lamia joined the company of the Striges, vampiric witches, and the Gelouds, child-killing spirits of Greek folklore. The line between Lamia and these other beings blurred until she became less a character with a personal story, and more a terrifying presence invoked in the night. By late antiquity, Lamia also took on the aspect of the seductress. Philostratus, in his Life of Apollonius of Tyana, tells how the philosopher encounters a Lamia disguised as a beautiful woman. She has ensnared a young man named Menippus with promises of marriage, yet Apollonius exposes her true nature as a vampiric demon who intends to devour her victim once the union is sealed. Here Lamia evolves into a femme fatale, her beauty a mask hiding predatory hunger. This version profoundly influenced later literature, giving Lamia the role of the enchanting but deadly woman who drains life from her lovers. Over time, Lamia's image fused with that of other female monsters. She was imagined as serpent-like Echidna but also as a night spirit, like the Empusa. In Byzantine and medieval folklore, the plural Lami became synonymous with witches, succubi, and spirits who preyed upon children and men alike. Her name was no longer just one story but a category of nightmare, an emblem of both maternal grief twisted into vengeance and female allure turned lethal. The figure of Lamia endures because she embodies contradictions that deeply unsettled the Greek imagination. She is both mother and destroyer, beautiful queen and grotesque demon, victim of divine cruelty and predator upon the innocent. Asteria nods. Queen says, her myth warns of the destructive power of jealousy and grief, yet it also reveals how easily fear can transform a human tragedy into a supernatural terror. In Lamia unblinking eyes, or in the empty sockets she could set aside, we glimpse the way myths themselves evolve. from tale to archetype, from person to symbol, from one woman curse to the eternal face of the monster. Any questions, please feel free to ask. Smiley face. Asteria says, it seems to embody that underground tension between Apollonian and Dionysian that seems to characterize the ancient Greek society. Queen says, oh, that's a really sharp observation from you, Sism, and it's actually a great way to frame Lamia in a more philosophical lens. Asteria smiles. Anyway, I think at times it merged with Empusa myth as well, isn't it? At some stage becomes hard to tell Lamia from Empusa when it comes to the figure of the dark seductress. Queen says, it did. I actually used mostly same sources. Let me grab them so they are known. Asteria says, yes, please. Queen says, Diodorus Siculus, Library of History 20.41.3, 1st century BC, Lamia as Libyan queen loved by Zeus, punished by Hera. Juris of Samos, fragment preserved in Athenaeus, Deepna Sophisti 8.337b. 3rd century BC, Lamia beauty and Hera's jealousy. Aristotle, fragment 647 Rose, 4th century BC, reference to Lamia as a bogey monster. Horace, Ars Poetica 340, 65-8 BC, plural Lamias child-devouring spirits. Asterius says, "Thank you." Queen says, Apollodorus Bibliotheca 1.9.9, 1st to 2nd century Sahara curse on Lamia and her monstrous transformation. Antoninus Liberalis, Metamorphoses 4, 2nd century Lamia cursed never to close her eyes. Plutarch on Superstition 15 equals Moralia 169e, 1st to 2nd century Lamia's night monsters. Philostratus, Life of Apollonius of Tyana 4.25, early 3rd century, Lamia as a vampiric seductress who ensnares Menippus. That our primary sources on today's class is about Lamia. Smiley face. And we went 15 minutes off time, smiley face. I hope you all enjoyed the classes. Asteria says, I would say also that Lamia was a figure that had a huge impact on imagination of several authors. It is portrayed in different ways in various works. In Horace during Romantic period, for example in Goethe or Keats, and even in a novel of the historian of religions Mircea Eliade. Asterius says, thank you for the class. Loved it. Queen says, red heart. Asterius says, and very informative. Queen says, well, I promised you those beasts long ago, smiley face. Smile. Asteria laughs. Yes, you owed me this. And they could be exploited also in role play. They make great characters for a story. Queen says, "Not."